Morning, it's Gareth Wood again, new story. Um, for those of you that have read Beasts of a Blue City, which I hope you have or are thinking of doing, the characters in this story will mean quite a bit more to you. The story's called These Streets I Thee Wed. Something a little different. It took Mallory weeks to find a homeless priest. Out there in the tumble trash and bustle blue streets of Birmingham, a sea of derelicts haunted the doorways, lots, towpaths and underpasses. He couldn't find the one he needed until Naked Jim hiccuped to attention in the old train graveyard near to Warstone Lane. Mallory had found tramps of all professions, from Albert the Scope, a disgraced doctor, to Annie Freckles, an alleged one-time librarian, even as far down and out as a down-and-out copper, Sergeant Pickles. But could he find the man of the cloth? No, not until old Rod, the seemingly immortal and glorious scholar of the streets, told him about Naked Jim out by the rusty rails. And he's a preacher, Mallory asked, his heart pounding with anticipation of success. A real-life priest, Rod. He's a priest. He's a priest, dear boy, but yes, he can do what you need a-doing, as long as you can wet his whistle with something better than the rotten white cider pops he's traded his teeth for. Now Mallory asked what it would take to do the trick. Rod rubbed the whiskers of his chin, and a rough sandpaper sound echoed around the silence of his thought. Could be, he began, that a nice little bottle of single malt would do the trick. How nice, something like Bowles or Teachers? Rod's face pruned. They're not nice, laddie. They're blends for a start, not singles, and you'd need to get down into Rackham's and lift a Lagavulin or a decent Glen. Mallory puffed out his cheeks. Don't know a thing about that stuff, Rod, and the security's a bastard in that liquor section. Naked Jim won't rouse without something over 12 years. Look for a drop from Islay and you'll be in. Mallory popped the collars of his battered donkey jacket and headed for the prize. Some of the rent boys were exchanging Polari out back by the loading bay when Mallory found them. Ah, Mallory, Thin Pucker greeted him. You need some new bona fide crackers? Mallory knew that meant they thought his trousers were shabby. Need knew everything, he grinned. Need a bona Poloni, another asked. I'm okay for arse, he replied. The rent boys laughed loudly and Pucker spat on a banana crate shattered and splintered beneath him. What brings you round here? Won't get too much on the beg unless you're offering some mouth. I could use a favour, Mallory proceeded to tell them what he needed and why. It wasn't the usual need, it wasn't selfish in the normal way, it was something that even the jaded Pucker wanted to help with, something he wanted to see. We get invites then, he asked, slapping Mallory's shoulder. Course, might have to bring your own chairs, but yeah, you boys are welcome. Now the well-to-do with garish bracelets and £4 hams for wicker baskets froze in their tracks as the wild boys of toilet trade and Polari chatter came bursting through the escalators and into the food court. It seemed like a hurricane of rags and leathers. They swarmed like startled swallows. The aged and gouty patrons clutched the wicker baskets to their chest and shrank as the rent boys yelled odd obscenities and danced around the meat counters, delicatessens, bakeries and, importantly, booze kiosk. Amazed and violently aroused, the bumbling big belly security staff began to give chase, as did the counter staff and assistants alike. The boys were quicksilver, lithe and lean. They ducked the groping arms, dodged the lame attempts to grab them, and jumped over the plastic tables on which Eggs Benedict shook with fear. They grabbed baguettes and ousted the guards by jousting with them as Mallory, totally unseen, snuck into the booze den and scanned the shelves. Mallory's eyes danced wildly ahead of the bottles. They were foreign currency, as intangible to him as vivisected aliens, and Mallory supped a cider, a lager, maybe a Guinness when the weather came in, but he knew nothing about whiskies. He tried to recall what that sly old hound Rod had said as the working boys from the back of Rackham's rocketed round there in their ribald riot. Single malt? Was it 12 years? Was it 16 years? The flapping toes of his busted boots danced the jig. The scene in the store was growing nasty by the second. The guard's fat-bellied, breathless, bulbous brethren had grown tired and were beginning to hurl tins of fruit at Pucker and the others. Mallory had to act. He ran a gloved finger across the rack and settled on a bottle of Glenfiddich Reserve. 18 years. This had better be better than 16. He dragged his liquor into the overcoat and legged it up the stairs. As he reached halfway, Mallory turned back and whistled loudly. Pucker and the others sped upwards after him. Pucker and the others sped up after him. Now naked Jim stepped out from under the tarpaulin as bare as the day he was born. Regardless of the cold, all Jim wore was his reverend's collar. His body was a litany of scars, wrinkles and pronounced veins that ran along his thighs and arms like bruised tunnels. "Christ, Jim, aren't you cold?" Mallory asked as he tripped over the dead train debris of the abandoned yard. "I can see my breath." Jim stood with his hands on his hips and stared upwards at the emerging office behemoths of the cityscape. "The Lord warms his servants in the only way that matters, my friend." Mallory tried as best he could not to stare at Jim's knotted and cold shriveled genitals. Still though, maybe some undies, Jim? Maybe some underpants? What do you think, Jim? And shame the maker by insinuating that the image in which we were created is somehow obscene? Fucking hell, even he wore a robe, Jimmy. Pfft. Jim waved him away with a trembling hand. "And unto them I said, behold a doubter of your word." And he turned away from Mallory and bent over to lift the flask. Mallory gritted his teeth and closed his eyes. Jim's flayed rectum was no sight for that time of the morning. "Anyhow," the visitor continued, "I was hoping you might do me and Tracey a favour like." Jim glugged deeply from his flask and snorted the wet from his moustache. "A favour? What could that be, dear Mallory?" "Well, you'll need to put on some shorts for a start." Mallory smiled, then lifted the bottle from his coat and watched as naked Jim's eyes opened with a rapture of want. The rag market was a hurricane of scarves and dancing materials. Tracey tried to avoid the high-end bridal shops that sat in places like Needless Alley, falling away from New Street's babble and bustle and Brummagem stampede, but sometimes she couldn't resist. Before heading down to the markets, she had shuffled to the windows of those flash dressers and stared in at awe at gowns that seemed somehow to glow or to rise away from the pavement of fag butts and rat-tailed shatterglass. She liked to look at the dresses and the veils, but she hated to see them. In her heart, down in that bloody locker where her dreams hid and where Mallory tried to catch them, she thought of herself draped in silk and finery, glittering at the straw with amazed faces all around her, gushing and jealous and wanting to be walking in her shoes, in her heels that glisten as she steps and glow as night is lit by a moon that pours over balconies like some kind of divine milk. But she shook it off. They were fantasies. It was just a dream, and the idea of it was absurd to her. She lost those dresses and the shoes that went so well with them, and she looked down at the crushed pumps, one size too big, and she sighed, and those boutiques had sunk into the remnants of reverie. And yes, she was stood on the outskirts of the rag market with the busy pigeons and the magpies who chased them beneath the wheels of taxis. She was there to get the components of her outfit, and being no seamstress, she and the others would do their best, even if her heart wasn't sure they could do anything at all. "Silk," two-stroke Maggie murmured from behind a permanent cigarette. "You'll need silk, Bab. If we can get a few rolls of something silky, we can pad the rest out with white cotton." It sounds fine, Tracey forced a smile, as best she could. And it must have looked forced, because two-stroke, a face as hard as winter pavement, put a leopard print arm around her shoulder and pulled her in tight. "We're going to get you looking busting, sweetie. Don't you worry about them la-di-da boutiques," which of course she always pronounced boutique-oos, "with their snotty bitches and 20-quid garters." I don't know where to start," Tracey said gently, feeling a small pang of joy at the thought of being flummoxed by clothing when her usual panic concerned where she would sleep and what she would do to eat each day. "Start with this." Two-stroke looked from side to side and plunged a hand down the back of her short skirt and into the top of her tights. She pulled out a crumpled fiver from the last punter who'd pulled into the back of the coach station and pressed it into Tracey's hand. "2 bacon sarnies, brown sauce for me, and 2 coffees, Bab, gold top milk. We need our dander up if we're going to get them glad rags done." The traders were mostly po-faced purveyors of rags at the best of times, but they were even more sullen and dismally dismissive when they saw Tracey approach, knowing by her clothing that she was derelict and had no deep pockets, or even pockets without holes at both ends. It didn't matter that Tracey had the kind of smile that lit even the roughest of nights. It didn't matter to them that her eyes, opals on a smudged tundra, could not be sullied by her circumstance. It didn't even matter to them that her voice was tender, disarming, and if you listened long enough, had a small song to it. It didn't matter to those traders at all. But they changed. They changed their faces when Two-Stroke bowled in, growling cigarette smoke from a face pasted with wax and powder. "Right, you tight shits. What's it going to take for a few feet of that satin up there, then?" They pointed at the neon card with prices per yard. "Come off it," Maggie scowled playfully. "That's the price for knobs who only come up here on Saturdays. Let's talk about what you can do for me." And that's how it went. Tracey had her own way of getting contributions to the dress. As the day drew on and the murkiness of early evening hung over Digbeth like webs on the sun, Tracey spoke softly to the stalls who were quiet and ready in their items for the cardboard boxes. Groaning as the idea of hauling it all back to the spare room of the house they had never painted dawned, they were increasingly happy to give us some offcuts here and there, some shreds and angles left over from the day's trimming. Whilst Tracey worked that way, Two-Stroke chased the fancy fabrics. Some of the traders she harried down to prices her purse agreed with, and others, well, she popped out to the cars with and brought them back googly-eyed and spent, helping herself to the cut she wanted the most as they smoked a cigarette and stared upwards at the rotunda looking for signs of the earthquake that had just rocked their pelvis. Slowly, as their feet covered every dusty inch of the market, Tracey and Two-Stroke got closer to their goal. A dress a quite wonderful tramp could be proud of. Now Mallory snagged a suit from the changing rooms of the gym off Moore Street. A few cans nicked and passed to Bill the whippet on the counter, and he was able to sneak into the lockers and pick what he wanted as the self-obsessed glared at their reflections in muscular mirrors, wishing they could somehow fuck themselves. The suit didn't match, of course, and there was no doubt in the blazer was 3 shades and 2 sizes removed from the 2 short trousers he had to go with them, but he would be a groom, albeit a patchwork one. As night came on and the neon of bars began to hover above the hooded hogwash of town's busier districts, and nestling down in their respective pitches for the night, Mallory and Tracey both pined for the other, feeling odd on the first night that they had spent apart for 2 years. Two-Stroke put Maggie up in her room for the night, ditching the corner of Borsall Heath Road and leaving the randy punters for the other waifs at the edge of the park. Mallory sat by a fire with the half-drunk and thankfully half-clothed naked Jim as they sipped cheap wine old Rod had bought before his usual routine of disappearing into the night without mention of why or where. As the flames of Jim's fire licked the debris around them, Mallory's eyelids began to sink. It had been a hectic few days, but he, Rod, Pucker, the McConnell boys, and even the moodiest bastard of all, the bear that was Tanner, had done their parts and readied that bridge near St Andrews for the craziest of all endeavours. A homeless wedding on the streets of beaten Birmingham. They had to wait until dusk. Even on the gnarled and thorn-knotty towpaths of the lesser-used canals, there was still the passing of workers to contend with until the dark set in. Mallory and the boys had been under what was affectionately known as the kissing bridge for much of the day. He had to shoo the moochers that began to hang around when they saw a crowd of tramps bustling with seats, their frayed knees bouncing at the sprint. One of the newer faces, Chrissy, helped Mallory more than anyone else, eagerly setting the torches and constructing the altar from 2 broken benches and an old Mellex Marvels crate. Mallory hung his suit above the roughage, out of sight. One of the O'Connell twins covered it in carrier bags to protect it from the wet, and Mallory's heart stopped mid-beat when 2 marching bobbies stopped beneath the bridge and nosed at his toil. "What's happening here, lad?" one of the tall policemen asked studiously, an eyebrow raised into his helmet. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you, mate," Mallory began nervously, scratching his beard and remembering that he planned to shave. "Try us," the other replied, some kind of amused look in his jaded eyes. So Mallory told him. Not only did they believe him, but they left a tenner in their wake, along with handshakes and best wishes. So perhaps it would be an evening of magic, Mallory thought quietly, then dismissed the idea and dashed off to the coach station toilet for a dry shave and a change of rags. Tracey stood ahead of the mirrors that lined the underpass at Smallbrook Queensway and truly marvelled at her dress. Two-Stroke smoked in quick puffs behind her, framing her with worn, sleepless, rouged eyes, and Tracey ran fingers along what was only rags the night before, and could not believe that cut-offs and discarded shards of silk and satin had been transformed into what she wore there. Lines and seams showed in intervals, but the shape of the garment, the way Tracey saw herself at last, it was amazing to her. The white heels that Two-Stroke had loaned to her were, Tracey was assured, Two-Stroke's best earners. "Told you, Bab," Two-Stroke coughed. $1 million. Not a sodding penny less. And Tracey turned to face Two-Stroke as the shoppers shuffled past them, their heads set on their own missions, the occasional glance towards the odd women posing ahead of the unpolished subway mirrors. And Tracey held Two-Stroke's hands and pulled her in close. This is incredible, Maggie. It means the world to me." "Oh, don't," Two-Stroke croaked. "Mine ain't a face for tears, Bab, but you'll get 'em out of me if you ain't careful and this makeup washes off. None of the punters will believe I'm 31. But Tracey pulled her in and held her and kissed her frazzled hair, and they set off towards the bridge, towards the towpath, towards marriage. Now, if anyone passing through the city had wondered where the assorted buskers and meandering instrumentalists were on that chilly evening in November, they would have needed to walk out of the city, down Digbeth High Street and over into Small Heath, to where the shadows of St Andrew's Stadium hung over the canals. As Tracey and Two-Stroke stepped down onto the verge that led to the underpass, the first strings of music hit their muffled ears. They squinted to see ahead of them, and then, as if the night had understood their need, lights began to flicker into waking. They were flames, the tips of torches, positioned around the base of the bridge, and there along the muddied grass that led to it. As Tracey adjusted her sight, she saw, crouched in their fellaheen poses, rows of the most renowned buskers Birmingham had to offer. There was Shoeless Pete, the cowboy guitarist, Marjorie Plummer with her two-string violin, and the Cable Boys with their recorders, and adding a soft metallic waltz to proceedings, Marcus Lee and the steel drum lads from the Bullring. The figures became clearer as Tracey, led by the unstoppable Two-Stroke Maggie, found their way to the path and into the throng of assorted tramps, drunks, and ruthless loafers that waited with their best wishes and smiles alive in the warmth of the torches that lit the way. The dogs owned by some of them lay contentedly together nearby, grateful of the occasion, with keen, half-sleeping eyes aimed at the table of food pieced together by every guest, be it stolen, begged, made, or even, albeit unbelievably, purchased. Pucker and the other rent boys, and the O'Connells, and even that loudmouth bastard Tanner, parted to allow Tracey through to where the fire burned brightest from a steel barrel filled to the brim with tinder. There, in the most ill-fitting and strangely assembled suit Tracey had ever seen, was Mallory. He glowed from the fire and grinned as broadly as the sea into which the canal finally bleeds. He was clean-shaven, with small spots of tissue covering the cuts from the Bic razor, and there at his side was old Rod, the kindest and wiliest wolf of the streets. He nodded his head and sunk his beard into his overcoat in admiration for the couple. Tracey took Mallory's hand and felt the tremors, and they were different from those tremors that she felt during the nights when they could not find a doorway to house them, or an abandoned lot with some sheeting from the rain. These shudders were nerves, so they played a different beat. "You're shaking, you silly bugger," Tracey whispered, noticing how large Mallory's eyes had grown as he stared in awe at her dress. "You are too," he said, as he ducked and kissed her hair. "You look amazing, Trace," he said into the intricate curls that Two-Stroke had fashioned. Naked Jim was thankfully partially clothed again. They had, albeit with some struggle, persuaded him to at least don a sheet. And he did, and it looked like a toga, and him with his unkempt facial hair and wild shock of wild curls, well, he looked very much like a philosopher from ancient Rome. Jim shushed the crowd, tapping a bottle. He lifted his Bible, a Bible they'd stolen from St. Martin's Church, and he began the ceremony. He stopped on occasion to sip from the whiskey bottle at his side, and, as they reached the climax, he began to cry, and had to be comforted by both Mallory and Tracey before he could continue. "Get to it, you bloody lush," Two-Stroke encouraged from the shadows. He did, and within a few muttered moments and the occasional sound of rustling from the uncut privet, Mallory and Tracey were husband and wife. The canal side echoed with the whoops and cheers of the small party, and as Tracey and Mallory turned to face them, they were handed a bottle of champagne bought with the money left by the policeman earlier that afternoon. The cork popped, and Rod made the joke about a car backfiring, staring animatedly at the road above them for true comedic effect. The dogs barked at the unseen cork foe, and everyone laughed like they had no worries in the world, and they had roofs to which they could return. And the meal was quite the mix. but even finer for it. People chomped on sardines they dipped into curry and wiped up with bread. They sipped from plastic cider bottles warmed by the fires, and the buskers played wild and out-of-tune lunacy that somehow, some way, like the ragged ensemble that danced crazily about them, came together in a patchwork of absolute uniqueness. Naked Jim fell into the canal and was rescued by Chrissy. They carried him to the fire and he warmed there, finally agreeing to take some of the cast of clothing and at least appear as if the cold of Birmingham's harsh November did not bother him. As the conversation quieted and Mallory and Tracey, staring silently at each other, found that the old horrors of where they would sleep that night returned, old Rod stepped forward and shushed everyone. "Now then," he said, twisting the ends of his moustache in that way that made him seem almost judicial. "It wouldn't be any kind of wedding night for a couple if they had to march back up there and fight for a doorway with the dossers too uncultured to be invited to this eminent occasion. Therefore, every single sorry sod who had been fortunate enough to see you beauties get married here tonight has chipped in what they could gather over the last few days, and we've got you this." Rod stepped forward and handed Mallory and Tracey a key, and the fob attached to it was from a hotel. It was the Burlington. "It comes with breakfast," Rod announced proudly, "and there's a proper tea waiting for you when you get there. And we couldn't get you a carriage to take you up there, but our tanner might let you ride on his back." And that burly drunk bastard even managed a thin smile. "I didn't think so," Rod beamed. And Mallory did his best not to cry, and Tracey did her best not to show her excitement at what a hotel room would feel like. They pulled Rod in, and it was as if he was smelling them, taking their sense of joy to keep him going just that little bit longer. As Mallory and Tracey trudged hand in hand up the muddied bank, the drunken buskers tried to play the wedding march, but produced something that made one of the younger dogs bite Naked Jim. The night porter barely looked up at Mallory and Tracey as they checked in. In not staring at them, it was the finest compliment the spotty clerk could have paid them. They felt as if they belonged there, in the lobby of the polished banisters and tables with coffees that steamed and glasses that clinked in cheering giggles. They felt natural. They went straight to the room and Tracey ran to the window, beneath which a radiator sat. In that moment, with the warmth at her knees and the city at her feet, she felt greater than she could ever remember. And when she turned around, Mallory was stood there, as still as paint. She could see the wetness on his eyes and heard the creak in his voice when he told her that he loved her, and she repeated the words as they held each other and marvelled at the room, the warmth, the day, and everything that had happened. They began to run a bath and laughed and kissed. They washed and ate and lay in the bed with its spotless linen and warm heavy quilt, and up there on the 8th floor, they both felt as if they'd been hoisted to a better place, to a plateau of deserved indulgence. Kissing once more, washed renewed, and above all, content that they were more than they had been. Mallory and Tracey realised that the day had been perfect, but not perfect in a way that others outside of the streets, outside of their lives, could possibly understand. See, it had been perfect because of its wild imperfections, which they reflected was why they loved each other so much. And the November moon eventually vanished behind clouds of freezing rain, and they lay there silently and listened to it hit the windows. But it couldn't touch them. Nothing could. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. Bit of a different story. I'll get back to the to all of the doomed loners of fiction next time. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good time, have a good day, have a good weekend. Look after yourselves. Take it easy. I'll see you again.